and welcome to Delving into the US dollar 125 trillion of assets, assessing and aligning key global institutions. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. My name's Paul Smith. I'm the ex-president of CFA Institute and currently a partner in Sustain Finance, www.sustainfinance.org, a think tank that looks at a lot of these issues. Delighted to be joined today by Andrea Webster, financial system lead for the World Benchmarking Alliance. Welcome, Andrea. And Luan Cie, head of group sustainability at CIMB in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So welcome to you both. It's great to have you with us. It's a very interesting moment in time. We've just had COP27 at Sharm el Sheikh. We're in the middle of COP15 on biological diversity. And Luan, I'm delighted to say that I saw recently that the Securities Commission of Malaysia has just released a new principles-based sustainable and responsible investing taxonomy, a bit of a mouthful, but a voluntary non-binding guidelines for financial institutions in Malaysia. So there's a lot going on. A lot of negative comment as well. COP27 didn't resonate perhaps in the way that we all hoped it would do. But coming out of that, there was the loss and damage fund idea, and hopefully some progress on that, and some recommitment anyway to the climate zone, the climate targets. Finance, what role do we play? That's always a challenging question. Do we lead this debate? Or are we fast followers in terms of being led by regulation and clients? Or is it a mix of all three? What tools do we have to help finance navigate this new world in which we live? Which part of the world is doing best? Really interested in the developing market perspective that Luan will bring to this conversation. What are the differences between the US, the European approach, the Asian approach, other developing markets? And that's always a challenge, as different regions are challenged in different ways depending on their economic development. The World Benchmarking Alliance that Andrea is a part of is here to help. I hope, Andrea, that's what you're going to tell us, and has developed as part of that, a financial systems benchmark. So, Andrea, I'm going to throw it over to you now to tell us a little bit about the WBA, a little bit about the benchmark. This, I believe, is its first year. Tell us about how it's been developed, what the key themes and findings are, and above all else, what you hope to do with it and how it's going to help finance play a bigger role in this sustainability conversation. Andrea, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for setting the scene so well. And I think the starting point really with this benchmark is explaining where that bold title of 125 trillion comes from, because that's the total sum of assets of the 400 financial institutions in our benchmark. I want to set the scene a little bit before we get into the discussion with Luan. So hopefully many of you listening are aware of World Benchmarking Alliance, as we have been around for 4 years. I know a number of institutions use many of our other benchmarks in their operationalizing in your due diligence and assessing companies that you invest in. But now at COP27, we've launched the finance system benchmark. If I can just, as Paul's mentioned, and as you all know, the finance system is such a crucial part on transitioning to a sustainable world. I use the expression that the finance system is the connective tissue because it touches every single aspect of life. So therefore, appropriate that we have a benchmark that's looking at financial institutions. In terms of who's in this benchmark, there are 400 institutions from across the world. Now, the institutions in here, what makes this unique, we have banks, that includes development banks. We have asset owners, including pension funds, both private and state, sovereign wealth funds. We have the top 5 investment consultants as their important gatekeepers, as well as asset managers, public markets and private markets as well, as well as the insurers. Now, the reason that they're all in this benchmark are they're all the institutions that influence the flow of capital. And therefore have an important role to play in using the power of the finance system to get to scale in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which is at the core of World Benchmarking Alliance, and moving the world to a place where we want to be. Now, in terms of, I hear a lot of people say to me, oh gosh, not another framework. But the real essence of World Benchmarking Alliance is that we want to be a guiding North Star on the direction of travel. It is a very noisy space out there with many principles, frameworks, regulations. We have taken all the regulations and rules that are influencing the finance system and created a methodology. There are just under 100 different principles that we've looked at. So in terms of being a tool and a North Star through this, we hope that we've done a lot of the legwork that you and the sustainability teams and those that are making decisions on where to follow can use. Now, this benchmark covers 3 key areas. I describe it as being broad rather than deep, because to be globally relevant and to cover the broad range of institutions and sections of finance that are in here, we go broad. We cover governance and strategy, which I'm looking forward to getting into the debate on that with Paul and Luann. We cover respecting planetary boundaries, which is both climate and nature and biodiversity, and then societal conventions, which is human rights and social issues, which is increasingly moving up the priority scale. And I think that would be interesting for our discussion. Now, I've worked in finance for 20 years and I'm proud of that. And I've been to lots of conferences and I hear a lot of talk about the progress that's being made. And I also know that there are an awful lot of people in finance working very hard in sustainability. But the harsh reality of the findings of this benchmark across 32 indicators and 97 different elements is that we're not where we should be. When you look at the 400 institutions scoring, the ability to score out of 100, this benchmark is aspirational. So we didn't expect anyone to achieve 100, but we did expect it to be further ahead than just 3 institutions who scored 50. And when you look at this, there are nearly 300 institutions that scored less than 20. So I think as much as we want to talk about the art of the possible, and we need to positivity in terms of where the narrative is at the moment being so toxic, there is justification for that in terms of the reality of what is being seen outside the bubble of finance. And I would really love us to explore this in the debate that follows. In terms of regional observations, there's obviously nuance to this, and ranking 400 institutions 1 to 400 needs contextualizing. I urge everybody listening to go into our website and delve into the benchmark. You can sort it through subsector, region, and measurement area, but there is a regional nuance. What we are seeing, obviously, is that it works. The scoring is stronger where it plays to the natural DNA of the finance system, and that's governance. So the governance indicators score the strongest. I think it is noticeable, again, we know that the situation in the US especially is difficult, to put it mildly, but it is noticeable that North American institutions, US institutions do lag behind. And what we see is that obviously Europe is leading as expected, Asia sits somewhere in the middle, Australia doing well, but in the US, there is still work to be done. I think what's also worth pointing out, as well as the different nuance in priorities. Climate obviously is front stage and centre in many discussions in those that are leading the way. But I think it's noticeable that in Asia and Africa, and probably linked to the backdrop and the sort of the holistic view of what's happening in those markets, is that they are typically scoring stronger on social issues. And I think what's also what I do like to point out is that it's not a foregone conclusion. that it's a European bank or an insurer that's going to lead the way. They're in the top end of the benchmark. There is a broad range across the results, and there are outliers in there, which is why we've invited Luann today to join from Malaysia, to show that it isn't inevitability that certain institutions need to lag behind. There is a lot that still can be done regardless of some of the hurdles that are faced in different parts of the world. I'm going to whiz through the 5 key findings, pulling out the findings again. I'm really keen that those use this, you take the nuance of it, but there are some stark key findings. The way that our methodology works is that it builds, and we have levels of base elements and indicators we measure on, and then we build up the scoring. So these key findings are based on those baseline indicators. In terms of our first indicator, and for me this was quite stark, that less than 20% of the institutions in our benchmark publicly acknowledge their impact, and that's positive and negative on people and planet, and yeah, that's the starting point. Now, financed emissions targets and climate goals, it's a rapidly moving target. I recognise that with a benchmark we have to draw a line in the sand, but that said, again, these were still lower than expected. Less than 40% of the institutions in this benchmark have made long-term net zero commitments. And that, given the noise and the discussion that's made within the finance sector, that's quite stark. Within that, 37%, less than 2% have made interim targets, and only 1% are backed by science. And again, I welcome us pulling this out in the debate, because whilst many in finance recognise this is hard, it is possible. There is a huge amount of tools, knowledge across the system. It is well established on the work that's needed to get to make those commitments. So I think it's worth exploring and asking why are those so low. Now we're seeing social issues and human rights rise up the agenda at the PRI conference in Barcelona. Those that were there week before last, that whole day dedicated to human rights. It's being recognised that it poses a systemic risk, and therefore it is relevant to finance, and we're not going to get an energy transition without a social transition. So baseline at the moment is very low, other than the regulatory requirements, typically modern slavery legal requirements and stewardship. We can see a connection to where there's a stewardship code, but otherwise it's low, and that is why there's a lot of discussion going on and debate about the need to regulate more strongly in this area. Inclusive finance is something close to my heart, and again, we can explore this. The funding gap. There's a huge debate in terms of the commitment that's made by finance to fund, but it's not following through. And in terms of disclosure, we see less than 2% disclose funding to low-income countries, and I know that is a key priority of a number of the regulators and multilaterals at the moment. So I think identifying those institutions that are achieving this is really crucial peer-to-peer learning across this benchmark. COP15 is going, as you mentioned, Paul, and again, a new area of measurement for many institutions. But that said, there is still a lot of work that could have been done previously in terms of even identifying risks. We've got less than 5% of institutions as this benchmark have a process in place to identify it, let alone set targets and chart progress. And so the work that comes out of COP15 is going to be crucial, I think, in terms of the intrinsic link to climate. And given the fact that more than 50% of global GDP is connected to nature's capital, again, this represents a serious element of risk. So impact and risk interchangeable within the finance system. So a very relevant discussion that can't be dismissed by finance. So there's a lot to digest. I'm acutely aware that that there is a very polarizing debate in finance at the moment. What I would love is I want to raise awareness amongst those within finance of where we actually stand. But then a benchmark is only as powerful of how it's used. And a key part of that is peer-to-peer learning and finding those institutions that are leading in their areas and sharing that across the system. I'm very much want us to be a neutral voice and create a safe space for institutions to come and engage with us. So let's hand it back to you, Paul, and let's explore this.
Thank you, Andrew. That was wonderful. Obviously, a benchmark is a snapshot in time. It's something that evolves as you do it again. And I believe you're going to do this once every 2 years, if I'm right in my thinking. And so this next 12 months is devoted to engagement, promoting the benchmark, and trying to get the 400 companies that are selected by you, I believe. Again, Andrew, I mean, this is something that you're co-opted into as opposed to volunteer for. So, yeah. You know, how does that work out? What feedback have you had from the 400? Has that been different region to region as well? Have there been notable engagement from any particular region? What's the negative feedback? It's always, sometimes I think it's always, you know, the learning always comes from the people who are your biggest critics as opposed to the ones who are your biggest supporters. And I'm still not 100% sure in my own mind how you're going to work with finance, the peer-to-peer learning that you mentioned. That's really interesting to me. How does that shape up in your mind? How's that going to work?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking the questions that hopefully those in the audience are going to find relevant, the bits that I've missed. The institutions that are selected in here they don't have a choice. They are in here because of the influence and the power that they have in the system. Obviously, most of them are there because of the asset size, but in the smaller regions, it's because of the influence, the outsized influence that they have, either in market share and the influence that they can potentially have politically as well. Let's put that out there. We base the assessment on publicly disclosed information. And so we can move on that regardless of whether they engage or not. But we do want it to be an inclusive process. So we pulled all the information that we could find from their websites, typically annual reports, sustainability reports, and created an assessment which was sent to every institution. They had the opportunity to comment on it, and then there was a time window for them to come back with information to protect the integrity of the process and to make sure that those outside finance trust and believe in it as well. There were tight deadlines, but it's really important that we have multi-stakeholder buy-in to this, not just the finance system. We have many other stakeholders that don't have a voice in finance, and we want to sit in that neutral position and be the voice of all of them. So institutions are in here whether they like it or not, but in a positive way. Those that engage, interesting. Those institutions that use our other benchmarks, because we're 4 years in, where our benchmarks across energy and decarbonisation, digital, food and agriculture, there's a number of useful methodologies and datas that existing financial institutions use. So those institutions typically engaged in the process. They were positive. There were some surprises, to be honest, with certain institutions who were expecting to be ahead and weren't where they thought they would be. But again, ongoing dialogue and being open and transparent means we can smooth that out. And there's the commitment to work with us on how they can improve. And what's interesting in some of them is that the sustainability teams, it's quite helpful for them because it's a neutral scoring system. It empowers them with internal dialogue. So there's a role there as well. Those institutions, it's interesting because on a regional nuance, we can see a connection to the regulator as well. So in the creation of the methodology and the roundtables, there were a number of regulators that we worked with. And where we had that top-down piece, we found institutions in those regions have been very positive, collaborating and scoring and come back to us in terms of they've got the analysis. And I think there's work that goes on in terms of where the gap analysis is and where they can improve. So there's an ongoing dialogue, because we sit in a position where we have visibility across different jurisdictions and different sections of finance. So that kind of feedback mechanism piece is really crucial. There are, and then I think obviously the standout one for me is the US. There are some institutions that typically that have a global footprint, that recognize the value of the footprint, and because of what's coming regulatory wise, they see this as a useful tool, so they're engaging, and it's timely. It's very timely for US institutions to make sense of what to use. There are obviously other institutions that that are less positive, or at worst ignorers. So that's a snapshot of where it's at. What I typically find is that when they realise that we want to be a carrot and not a stick, and we want to share the knowledge and the visibility that we've got into these institutions, typically the conversations turn positive.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Stand down for now. I'm going to bring the conversation over to Luann, and I'll try and make her blush. CIMB have done incredibly well in this survey. 7th out of 400 institutions. That's no mean achievement. And first in governance, which is really quite remarkable, and very high up in the top 10, both regionally and globally, in terms of that governance statistic as well. And as Andrea said, tone from the top is so important in this debate. So tell us a little bit about how that works in the Malaysian context, and perhaps in a broader Asian context as well. How have you accomplished those scores in governance to start with? And tell us a little bit about how you've interacted with the Benchmarking Alliance, and what value you have seen in this benchmark.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Just a very quick introduction to CIMB for those of you, I think a lot of you probably haven't heard of us. We are an ASEAN-based bank. We're based out of Malaysia, but we've got significant operations in across ASEAN: Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So that's most of ASEAN. We're around 150 billion USD in assets. So just to give you a feel of the size. So yeah, so how did we do this? To be frank, we were very surprised as well. I mean, we have been working very hard at this. Sustainability is part of our core strategy, and has been since, I think, 2019, when I started up the department at CIMB, and we've been doing actually a lot, but really from not very much in 2019. So we literally started from zero at that point, apart from philanthropy, right? So how did we do it? I think, as you said, especially in Asia, the tone from the top is immensely important. We had actually our very first kind of push or impetus was from our global institutional investors. So that kind of hit the top level at the CEO, CFO level, and then the board came on board, and the board is amazingly strong. So just to give you an illustration, I've got 2 members of my board who are also trustees of WWF Malaysia. So that just gives you a feel of how strong and bought in they are. So amazing support, and we're very serious about this. When we started doing this, we were this was before any regulators in Malaysia were talking about this. So we were really kind of working with the regulators to kind of get the ecosystem up and running. So yeah, it's.
And I understand compensation is across the organisation is tied to some sustainability goals. I'd be interested in how that works. What are the measures for that, for instance?
Yeah, so essentially we've sustainability KPIs sit in what we call the collective scorecards, which fund the bonus pools of every division. So it's not in the individual KPIs, but it determines how big your bonus pool is. Well, it's one of the factors, obviously, not the entire factor. But so that has helped a lot in getting people on board and aware. So some, of course, very supportive, some kicking and screaming. But in terms of what's in it, it really depends on what your function is, right? So if you're in risk, it's to do with transaction and climate risk and integration of sustainability into the risk management framework. If you're in the front lines, it's a lot of sustainable finance products and services, also engagement with clients and things like that. So it really depends on where you sit. So highly tailored to what you are delivering towards this whole sustainability kind of roadmap.
And how?
Sorry,
Yeah,
forgive
please.
me. And there's a question that you asked, Paul, that I didn't answer, and it's key to why CIMB have scored well is transparency, because not only do you do this, but you also disclose it. And one of the key pushbacks that we get from sustainability teams, and perhaps those that are more opaque, is that we don't want to spend time reporting, we want to spend time doing. But the reality of it is that because of this multi-stakeholder interest and understanding that finance can't achieve it alone, we have to do it together, that disclosure piece and the transparency of what you do in sharing it is one of the key reasons is why you score well as obviously you're walking the talk.
Yeah, and to be frank, disclosure is not my favorite pastime either, but it is immensely important. And these benchmarks like these are very, very important for internal engagement, as Andrea, you mentioned, right? Whether it's a shaming because, oh my goodness, how could you have done worse than bank X, right? Or whether it's an encouragement for people who've been doing the work. I think banks should take this, or financial institutions should take this internally and wave it in front of their boards.
And I'm also fascinated. You're a bank. You do a lot of lending, obviously. How does that work? I mean, one of the things that Andrea pointed out in her takeaways was perhaps the difference between the way organizations themselves operate. They score highly themselves, but when it comes to their financing activities, perhaps those principles aren't driven down enough into the business of the bank. How have you approached that, and how does it work when your loan officers are out there in the field? What sort of scoring are they doing on projects that they're financing? How does that all fit together from a client side? Because I think that's really where the rubber meets the road for a lot of financial institutions. It's one thing to look at yourself. It's quite another thing to impose these sorts of performance criteria on your lending, for instance.
Yeah. So because, as I said, when we started, we did this ahead of any requirements on us. We didn't start from disclosure. It wasn't outside in. It was more of what we thought that we needed to do, both from, are we accountable for our impacts, for the impacts of our financing and what our clients do with our money on the environment and society, and as well as the incoming risk in terms of climate risk, etc., on our clients and therefore on ourselves. So it was very much we need to do this not because people are asking or regulators are asking, but because we think it's the right thing and it's from a business perspective. So this what you said, Paul, about rubber hitting the road, that was actually the first policy. So we had two policies that we did on day one, at the same time as when we set up the unit, which was the overall sustainability policy, which was our overarching principles, and that was aligned with the principles for responsible banking, which we were one of the drafting members of. And the second thing we did was the sustainable finance policy. So that governed our corporate lending and our commercial banking financing. So that was actually the very first thing we did, because that was the immediate impact. Of course, rolling that out across countries took a bit of time. So we always start with Malaysia and Indonesia as the the two biggest countries and then to the others. But every country has their own laws, has their own requirements. So doing that took time. Yeah.
And I imagine the reporting angle of that, the transparency, as you get down into the granular, is really quite difficult to do. I mean, have you been able to aggregate that to your satisfaction?
No, we haven't been great at doing that. So how we approached it, because when we first started doing this, apart from in Singapore, which was ahead, we were one of the first banks to start asking these questions. So how we approached it was robust process and institutionalization, but kind of not very difficult requirements. So it was tough on the process, not so tough on the requirements. So and then once the process and once people got used to being asked environmental questions by the bank, then we went to the next step and started asking more questions, putting in more requirements, requesting for more information. So it's a kind of a progressive thing, especially important when you're the only bank or when you're the first bank to do that. Otherwise, you just scare away all the clients.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you one final question on Islamic finance, if I may, Luann. I mean, obviously, Malaysia is a majority Muslim country. Indonesia, as you commented on, is a big market for you. And Islamic finance, I've always felt remarkably supportive of the sustainability goals. It's about fairness, profit participation, all of those good things. And give us the perspective of your Islamic banking unit. Has it been easier to get these concepts into Islamic banking? Is it supportive of it? How do you think about it internally? Because obviously you've got to blend, I guess, the traditional banking with Islamic banking to get an overall score.
Yeah, absolutely. So CIMB is a big player in Islamic banking. Purely, not purely because of the markets we're in, but that is definitely one of the things that's driven that. Interestingly enough, when the regulators in Malaysia started looking at sustainable finance, they started it under the Islamic banking side.
Really?
Yeah. That was
interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and so I think so very, very similar type of principles and how you look at things. I think the difference is the why, right? Why am I doing it from Islamic banking? For the Islamic banking angle, it's more of a religious reason, but in terms of what you do, is quite similar. So it's we have. Of course, Islamic banking is a major supporter of this, and actually a lot of the innovations come out from the Islamic banking side. They do a lot of the new products and services for sustainability, but in terms of the overall governance, it's group-wide, and even the regulators have realized, okay, no, it can't just be driven out of the Islamic bank because that's only part of the banking system. It needs to be the entire banking system.
It feels like it sets the culture well. It's interesting because obviously Malaysia's you've got such a mix of cultures there, but obviously the Islam thread is strong, and I get the real strong sense that that's where the governance top down comes from, even though that was one element and you took it broader across the system.
Yeah, it's yes and no. So yes, culture, but does it? So we've got, for example, Sharia or Sharia courts, but it doesn't really permeate everything. But it's very much kind of ethical banking, and in fact, Islamic finance is so entrenched that if you walk into probably any bank in Malaysia and you open a savings account, it's probably an Islamic account. It's just de facto.
Interesting.
Thank you, Luann. We've got 5 or 6 minutes left. Andrew, I'm going to flip the final question to you anyway. I'll bring Luann in once you've finished. Optimist or pessimist? That's always a key thing as far as I'm concerned. What are the main challenges facing the financial institutions, and how do you hope, when you dream forward 10 years, how do you hope this benchmark is going to have impacted the financial services industry? In what way, and what are the sort of the main things that you're looking for in terms of improvement?
Ooh, good questions. I'm naturally a positive person and a glass half full lady, and I wouldn't get out of bed every day and do this if I thought we were all doomed. And I think I have the benefit of having seen the incredible positive work that's being done in the finance sector. So although I know there's a lot that's not disclosed, I do know that there's a lot of good people in finance who are working very hard on this. I think the main challenges are just I think there's a couple. One, lack of understanding of the finance system from outside and within, and the many contradictory asks of the finance system. So, and that is a challenge. And one of the hopes that I would really love from this benchmark and work going forward is to help bridge that language gap and that understanding gap between finance and between all the other stakeholders. And that's why, I harp on about transparency and disclosure. That's needed to help create that positive narrative, because I can see finance retrenching, and the legal and the compliance teams are now kind of getting wrapped around the sustainability teams because there's a litigation risk, and we need to step back from that. I think that will be a negative path to go down that will slow progress, not speed it up. So I think that for me, main challenges, putting aside all the macro that's going on as well. In terms of 10 years down the line, and my hope for this benchmark is I've talked about this, and that we're not going to change finance overnight in one sweep. It's a whole series of nudges, because if it happens too quickly, it will have horrible unintended consequences. That said, it does have to accelerate. We can't carry on at the glacial pace that we're at. My sense is that it's going to pick up in momentum. There's a lot of people, the discourse there's recognition of finance's role, and it's the how piece. But there's a lot of people that are leading on that and working on it. So I'm expecting the pace to pick up. Where we get to in 10 years' time is that obviously sustainability moves markets, and the changes that are happening with ISSB, it needs to be built into the accounting system. And when we've got a true price on carbon, on water, on waste, and the value that added, that's complicated. But when we get to moving markets, we're prepared. We have to start somewhere, and the benchmark is helping those institutions get ready for when we get to that point. And I hope that we'll wake up one day and realize, look back and think, see how far we've come. But we're right at a crucial point.
Thank you. A great point there as well to finish on, for accounting for sustainability as well, where obviously that's a core theme. Luann, I'm going to leave the last word to you. We've been very complimentary about CIMB, but there's much work to be done. Your scores obviously are not perfect. The benchmark, as you said earlier on, tries to serve as a motivation and incentive to do better. When you look at your work, your specific work, as your head of this within the bank, what are you focused on? What areas do you think you can make most impact in? And if you could bring in the biodiversity a little bit there, because obviously Malaysia, deforestation, palm oil, all of these things are hot topics in our region, and just how particularly you think about that and the goals that you're striving for over the next few years in the bank.
So I was just looking at the areas for improvement for CIMB on the financial system benchmark, and one of them was about reducing finance emissions with the interim target. So, and just to illustrate how fast this is moving, we've just because we're members of NZBA, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we have announced our interim sector targets for 2 sectors, coal and cement, and we will be announcing interim targets or 2030 targets for the other 7 sectors in probably the next year or so. So all that is happening, and it's happening very quickly. Action planning and engagement with the clients as well, and how we're going to get there. So all that is moving. That's a very, very big piece that we need to get out of the way, and that is for climate really the key mover and how we will contribute. So that is really a big focus. On biodiversity, this is something that we really need to look at the moment. As you said, right? Malaysia and Indonesia and even Cambodia, Thailand, all highly biodiverse countries, biodiversity hotspots. So we haven't yet looked at the portfolio level risks, but what we have done is to stop the immediate damage. So one of the when people talk about biodiversity risk, it gets very complicated because how do we measure it? How do you aggregate it? What kind of metrics? Blah, blah, blah. But we're not worrying about all those portfolio level stuff yet, and we're watching very closely. But I'm not going to let that stop me from doing what I can now, which is requiring NDPE of my land use change clients. So we've done that. We have started rolling it out, massive internal engagements and because a lot of land use sectors, but we've managed to push it through. And so we've started, but not yet at the portfolio level.
I love that. And you personify the fact that you just get moving, do it, don't wait till perfect.
Great. Thank you both. Luann Xie from CIMB, Head of Group Sustainability there, Andrea Webster, Financial System Lead of the World Benchmarking Alliance. Thank you both so much for presenting the benchmark to us today. That was the Financial System Benchmark. That was really a fascinating discussion. I'm very grateful to you both and looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Great being here.
Bye.
Bye.